My last memory of my grandmother. I'm 12 years old. It's a cold winter night here in central Pennsylvania. And like many other winter evenings, I walked over to my grandparents' house to play a game of cards. I had both the fortune and misfortune of growing up next to my grandparents. I say misfortune because it was a well-known secret in my family that my grandfather was an alcoholic. And when the whiskey bottle came out and the fire appeared in his eyes, we all knew to avoid him. My grandmother, however, was a captive audience, confined to a wheelchair after complications from arthritis, took one leg and then both. I can see my grandmother sitting on her wheelchair at the kitchen table, a blanket snugly wrapped around her prosthetic legs, her gnarled hands barely able to hold the cards. On this night, our game of choice was Skippo, a game I probably haven't played since. My grandmother shuffled cards like a child does before they learn how to properly shuffle, placing them face down on the table in front of her and slowly moving them in circles together. I am not sure how effective this method of shuffling is, but I didn't object. My grandmother's warmth, the softness of her voice, was perhaps her way of counterbalancing my grandfather's anger. I've never been able to identify the demons that haunted him or the reason his temper would flare at the slightest provocation. And I don't recall him ever physically hurting anyone during one of his rants. But I do remember that my sweet grandmother was often his target. Arthritis had disfigured her body, and it seemed like he was intent on doing the same to her spirit. But to this day, when I picture my grandmother, I picture a mischievous light in her eyes that, despite my grandfather's best efforts, could not be extinguished. And that light was there on this cold December night as we were playing cards. I didn't realize it at the time, but this would be my last game with my grandmother. And it wasn't a good night for her. I won hand after hand. And at the end of the evening, when it was time for me to leave, she jokingly said, "Maybe we shouldn't play cards together anymore, since you always win anyway." The next morning, when my grandfather went to help her out of bed, as he did every morning, her body was cold. My grandmother Annie was 63 years old. When you think you know someone, think again. Fortunately, this isn't the whole story of my grandparents. A few years before she passed away, she had a health scare and almost died. And I was too young to fully realize what almost losing his wife of 40 years did to my grandfather. But even to my child eyes, the change was obvious. This cold man of steel, with his iron fists that seemed perpetually clenched, softened. And my grandparents began spending more time together and seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company. And when I would go over to visit, I would often see them sitting close together, sharing stories, laughing. I don't know if he quit drinking, and I don't know what happened to the anger. But I noticed that he touched her like she was fragile, and he wanted to do everything he could to keep her from breaking. My childhood home no longer exists. Years ago, my dad sold the house, and the new owners decided to demolish it. And I stopped by to watch the construction workers tearing it apart. It was a strange feeling, seeing a building that had played such a large role in my life reduced to broken pieces. It's now a place that only exists in my memory. And over time, our memories break down into bits and pieces that never really add up to the whole. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's best to remember the past in pieces. Maybe one of the benefits of time is that we get to decide which memories we want to keep. If I ever have grandchildren, I will tell them everything I know about my grandparents, the good and the bad. But the story I want them to remember is the one about a man who, before it was too late, finally loved my grandmother the way that she deserved to be loved. Thank you.